Good morning. A warm welcome to our December 2020 Beyond Recruitment Economic and Labour webinar. By way of introduction, my name is Liza Viz, CEO of Beyond Recruitment, and it does really give me great pleasure to be hosting this webinar together with our valued guest speaker, Shamubeel Eaqub. Thank you for joining me and our Beyond Recruitment team as we launch our 2020 Beyond survey, finding out our findings and our latest salary guide. Over the last 10 months, every one of us have worked through uncertain times caused by one of the biggest pandemics in modern history. This virus has and will continue to have a profound impact on every aspect of our lives, both professionally and personally. Before I hand over to Shamubeel, I wanted to thank you all for participating in our annual survey. We heard from over 500 organisations up and down New Zealand, representing a wide range of business sizes and industry sectors. In some of the key findings in our survey, business respondents have told us that this year's economy was far harder to thrive in than previous years, and in fact found it harder even than the GFC. Not all sectors were impacted equally. The tourism industry found it the hardest, followed by financial services, energy, and healthcare. Across the regions, Auckland businesses and jobs have been hit the hardest than any other part of the country. The perceived exodus of talent into the market has not become true, and it's harder to find talent this year than last year, not helped, of course, by the border closures, leading to a lack of specialist talent coming into New Zealand. Border closures have hit larger businesses harder than smaller businesses, and this continues. 55% of Kiwi companies in our survey made no redundancies, and 21% let less than 5% of their staff go. 62% of companies in the survey asked most of their staff to work from home. That was 3/4 or more. 55% of companies did not take the wage subsidy, and interestingly enough, 85% did not take the extension to the wage subsidy. 9% of our respondent companies said they have frozen recruitment activities for the moment, whilst 22% are hiring fewer people than originally planned. And interestingly enough, 87% of our respondents believe that the government is well prepared for a future wave of the virus. The detailed report from this survey, together with the updated COVID salary guideline, will be available to you straight after this webinar. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Shamubeel Eaqub. Being one of New Zealand's most prominent and highly regarded senior economists, Shamubeel needs no introduction. Shamubeel provides economic consulting to senior leaders across both the public and private sectors through Sense Partners. This morning, Shamubeel will be sharing real-time insights on what the impact of COVID-19 through 2020 has meant for business, for employees and for employment, and of course, as we prepare to embark on 2021. Few housekeeping things to note. The webinar will finish at 12 noon. We will leave about 10 minutes prior to this finish time for questions, and you have the opportunity throughout the webinar to send your questions through on this link. There is a Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be collating these throughout the presentation, and I will present these questions to Shamubeel at the end of his presentation. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Shamubeel. Welcome, Shamubeel.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really nice to be back for another Beyond event. And the last time we spoke was in the midst of the first kind of wave of the virus. So much has happened this year. But more importantly, I think for me, the big thing has been we've learned so much. And so much of this year has been a surprise, both in good ways and in bad ways. And so what I want to do is take us through a little bit of what we have experienced through 2020 and give us a little bit of insight of what might happen in 2021. But I got to be honest, one of the things that I've learned in 2020 is trying to forecast the economy is even harder than we knew. So what should we start with? Well, I think the first thing is around a bit of a scene setter, and that's really around we have the pandemic now, and there is a beyond, and the starting point is we've just experienced one of the biggest shocks in our lifetimes. If you look at the disruption to economic activity, the job losses that we've experienced, it's been extraordinary. But despite that disruption, what we have seen is that we had this extraordinary public health response and a fiscal response and a monetary policy response. And as a result, our economy is doing pretty well so far. Most activities that we look at is back to pre-COVID levels. But we're seeing lots of differences across industries, occupations, provinces versus the urban centers. So it hasn't been an even story. It's been very concentrated pain for some, and generally speaking, pretty good conditions for others. While the pandemic will end, I think it is also a big inflection point. We are seeing some big changes in the way that we think about politics. I think the last election was extraordinary in the big vote that we had in favor of Labour. But also, I think in the way that we think about the economy, I think it's really tested our assumptions in terms of how quickly we can change, what we can change, and how we can make change. One thing that has happened, though, that I think is important is the central bank, which was such a big driver and influencer of the economy in the last 30 years, since pretty much the days of Don Brash when he was the governor. Well, that has changed. There is just so much debt out there that the current very low interest rates are unlikely to change anytime soon. So it's going to be government that's going to drive most of the economy. And that matters because it's something new for all of us. We haven't seen big government, interventionist government in the way that we're about to see for many, many decades. So we're all going to have to re-engineer our minds and our ways of thinking and the way that we conduct business, because our economic environment is going to be much more about what's happening in Wellington and in politics than would have been the case in the past. The key issues for us, I guess, as employers and thinking about the labor market is very much around, despite this recession, what we have seen is there is still a huge amount of labor shortages. So despite the job losses, which were very concentrated in some occupations and groups, in reality, the growth in these other places are not being met by lack of immigration. And I suspect that immigration, which was such a safety valve for our labor market and our economy over the course of the last few decades, is not going to come back in the way that it was pre-COVID. So in the space of 12 months, a lot of things I think are going to be changed. And the other thing that's really important for us to think about is how do we plan for an economy that is very uneven and unpredictable? So we need to be much more resilient, much more flexible, but it doesn't mean that you lose sight of what is fundamentally important to your business. So things like culture and cohesion, I think, become much more important in the current environment, because when I talk to my clients that have been through the disruptions, the ones that have done really well out of it are not necessarily about their industry or their sector. It's much more about the culture and the way that they operated. And that, I think, is going to be really tested, because we've got the issues of people working from home, people working more flexibly. How do you ensure culture and cohesion when you're not together as a team quite so often? So we're going to have to think really hard about how we make all of these things work really well for us. So I'll talk a little bit about the economic backdrop first, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more of the implications for the labor market. And I think the word that really kind of sums up the last 12 months, and despite all predictions, is resilience, right? I mean, we've done extraordinarily well in New Zealand compared to other places, but we need to understand that what we're experiencing in New Zealand is not the same as what is happening in the rest of the world. So in the rest of the world, we saw a huge second wave, much bigger than the first. And they're starting to get it under control, particularly in the UK and Europe. They have new restrictions, and that means that they are going to get on top of it. But we're going to see quite a lot of impact in terms of their economies and the disruptions that they might see in their economies. In contrast, you look at what's happened in places like Australia and New Zealand. Australia has done it harder than we have, but we are down at that very low level of infections and very few deaths, which is a good thing. And if you look on the right-hand side, I think one of the big takeaways for me was when the recession first hit and the pandemic first hit, we were like, oh, how do we trade off between closing borders and making these restrictions versus saving the economy? Well, it turns out when you kill 4,000 people, people are not so happy and people lose confidence in the economy. And that's exactly what we saw in the data. So in the period of the early part of the pandemic, in May, June, April, May, when we saw those big restrictions, big surge in the cases, the economies around the world all shrank. So if you're on the left-hand side, your economy is shrinking. And if you're high up on the chart, you kill lots of people too. So it's not like there is a clear trade-off between how many people you kill and what sort of economic impact you have. So regardless of what happens, the virus and the pandemic means that your economy will be disrupted. The alternatives were seen as quite difficult, but in reality, what it turned out was we could choose between two states. One was you have a very hard, successful lockdown, and once you come out of it, you go back to some level of normality within your own domestic economy. Or you can have open borders, let things run, and you get this constant case of infections, suppression measures like lockdowns, and the end result, it turns out, is much worse than what we have chosen to do. But we didn't know this beforehand, so we made a right decision in what was right for New Zealand, rather than arguably thinking that we're going to prioritize the economy. So that to me was quite important, in that the way that we thought about the economy was very different, and the way we thought about the public response was very different. Now, as you know, I'm a complete geek and I love this stuff. And I look at things like, how much concrete is being poured, how many cars people are buying, what people are spending their money on. And what was really interesting was that that lockdown that we had in April, May was very disruptive, right? You can see that in the charts. There's that sharp drop off in activity. But then we rebounded pretty quickly. In total, we're still going to be down compared to last year. So let's not sugarcoat this, right? We're still having a recession. It is still going to be painful. There will still be some businesses that'll be doing it really, really tough. But at least what we're seeing compared to most other parts of the world is our level of activity has returned to the kinds of levels we had seen pre-COVID hit. And we see the same thing on the right-hand side, which is retail sales. And you can see that retail sales fell very sharply through the lockdowns, but then rebounded very strongly afterwards. And that is a much better outcome than going through this long, lingering period of uncertainty, suppression measures, and all those other bits that go with it. So we still have lots of parts of the economy that are suffering. The border is still closed. International tourism is closed. Yes, domestic tourism has increased, but it's not enough to offset the international tourists coming in. So we are going to have some impacts in different parts of the economy, as we will in the nature of the disruptions that we're seeing in the global economy. One of the big and kind of very lasting, lingering impacts of the recession so far has been through imports. Now, I think we talked about this a lot at the beginning of the year. We knew that supply chains would be disrupted. And in New Zealand, what we have seen is our imports have been falling consistently right through this year. And that has had a really much bigger impact on places like Auckland and Wellington than it has in the provinces. That's because the big cities are places of consumption and services centers and distribution and logistics, and less about production of physical goods. So what we saw was the big cities like Auckland and Wellington got hit much harder. Places like Queenstown and the surrounding areas that are very reliant on international tourism got really hit hard. But a lot of the other parts of the economy are in fact growing. And part of that was around relative resilience in exports. So you'll see that on the right-hand side, our exports did suffer in that early part of the pandemic, but a lot of that was about logs not going to China. Things like dairy, fruit, meat, all of those things were growing quite strongly. But in the last 3 months, things have come off. So we are not immune to what's happening in the global economy. The fact that there is still a pandemic, there is a second wave, there are shutdowns, restaurants are closed, people might lose jobs. Those things will have an effect on us. And the provinces that have been very sheltered until now, they are feeling a little bit more vulnerable than they have for a little while. So again, this is that very unusual recession where we're not seeing things move in sync. Instead, what we're seeing is this incredible volatility and uncertainty that we're not used to in the way that we think about the economy. So it's probably longer, more lingering, and more uncertain than we have seen in the past. Now, part of the reason why we've seen this extraordinary rebound in activity is not just because of the extraordinary public health response, but also because the extraordinary response when it comes to monetary policy and fiscal policy. So what the Reserve Bank did and what the government did. So the central bank went all out, right? We cut interest rates to zero, practically zero. They flooded the financial system with money. They're going to do more of it. All of those things really helped because it shored up confidence, reduced people's cost of borrowing. It really hurt savers. And now we're seeing the expected consequences of rising house prices because people are borrowing money to buy houses from each other. The unfortunate thing is, while the Reserve Bank can do that, it is not having the desired impact of increasing investment in the economy, right? So what we're seeing is people buying and selling houses from each other, but lending to businesses, lending to farms, lending to house building, they're all falling. And that tells us that while the Reserve Bank can do a lot around cutting the cost of borrowing and those kinds of things, it's probably done less in terms of actually getting money into the real parts of the economy that's going to create jobs and economic activity. So that's going to be one of the big challenges for the Reserve Bank, is they're quickly losing relevance. So while they have done as much as they can, they have probably spent all their bullets. And with so much debt in the economy, the government's got huge amounts of debt, the private sector has huge amounts of debt. It's very unlikely that even if inflation comes back, that the Reserve Bank will be able to raise interest rates very much. So when your tools are kind of ineffective or unable to be used, you have to think about what else is going to happen. And I think what else is going to happen is more of what has happened in 2020, which is government took a really big part in the way that they managed the economy. So the initial response was, just open slather, right? The wage subsidy and those kinds of things was make it as flexible and as open as possible so that we can allow people to stay at home, stop businesses closing, and we can get through this initial very uncertain phase. But as time is progressing, we're moving into the next phases of what the government will do. So the initial one was, of course, that $40-odd billion of additional infrastructure spending. So that is slowly going to come through. Big projects take time because they got to go through a lot of processes. But there's also, I think, a bigger shift that's taking place, and that's really around the government being quite different in the way that it operates in the economy. The consensus of the last 30 years was government should be small, we should let the Reserve Bank manage the economy, and government should be more focused around things like regulatory management and those kinds of things. That is, I think, no longer true. We're going to see governments becoming more activist around industrial policy, regional policy, immigration, you name it. Everywhere you go, you're going to see the government taking a more active role, because if you don't have the Reserve Bank managing the economic cycle, they're going to have to think about how do we create more equitable growth, because that's how you maintain political and social license. So this is a really, really big change. And this election, like I said before, it was extraordinary in that big swing toward the majority that we saw for the Labour Party. But not surprising, given the extraordinary success in the public health response. I think the main thing is around what does it mean in terms of how this government and future governments might operate. I think the starting point is there has been a huge vote of confidence in the response to the pandemic, and that's good. The interpretation by our Prime Minister, I think, has been that people have trusted us to respond to the pandemic, but they have not necessarily given us license to do all the other things that the Labour Party stands for. So even though on the right-hand side, you can see most of the country has turned red, including the South Island, which I find quite extraordinary, having grown up in Lincoln. But I think this is quite interesting because what it tells us is actually something is going on in terms of how New Zealanders can operate in the political cycle. It's a really big contrast to what happened with the American election around the same time, where it remained extremely polarized. In New Zealand, we're not nearly as polarized, and I think we rightly can see that there is actually far less difference across our major political parties than people think. So centrism, I think, is the thing that's driving a lot of it. And I think we can arguably agree that our Prime Minister is very good in crises. She will respond quickly, she will respond boldly, but when it comes to structural issues like housing, poverty, health, you name it, she's much more incremental and cautious. So instead of expecting big, rapid, bold changes, I think what we should expect is fairly gradual, very cautious changes in policy arenas. And that matters for us because I think people are misreading the cues. A lot of people think that we're going to see a huge amount of activism from the government really, really quickly. Instead, I think what we should expect is the government being very careful and slow, and that might create more uncertainty because we may not know what's coming. Now, this is a slide that I use a lot, both in terms of describing what we have experienced, but also I think it has some very big lessons for us as people who employ, people in our own public and private lives. But the big thing that came for me with the pandemic, the big lesson was, well, things are abstract, right? When we talk about risk, we don't actually understand what risk is. And that's not surprising, right? Because we can't, as humans, we can't imagine something that we haven't seen before. We can't just process it because we rely on heuristics, on rules of thumbs, and on past experience. And so because we can't imagine new things, we kind of really try and cling on to what we've got now. But except everything that 2020 has taught us is that you almost have to park what you've got now. Yes, you should take heed of it, but you also have to be able to imagine a new future. So when it comes to things like working from home or different ways of working, well, for a lot of businesses, it really showed them that there was an alternative to how we used to do things. But the way to make change, I think, is really about how we were able to discuss quite significant technical ideas like viruses, pandemics, transmission, and very good communication. And I think that has lessons both for politics and for business, because if we're going to want people to go along with us in terms of the kinds of changes and things that we might do to our businesses, we have to take people with us. We have to trust them with technical and detailed information, and we have to communicate it really well. That's the way that you build trust and build cohesion and good culture. Even when there are stark trade-offs, right? When the pandemic first hit, we thought that there would be a big trade-off between economic growth and the health outcomes. We were wrong, because what we saw was actually a good health response was the right response when it came to the economy. And so we can learn, but when there are trade-offs presented in front of us, the way that we can still make the choice that we want to make is if we can get that collective action, build the consensus, build that broad support. That is the path to success. That, I think, is really important for businesses, because that surely is one of the biggest lessons out of 2020. Even though it doesn't feel like it right now, COVID-19 is actually going to be a relatively short-term thing. It's going to be a blip. But I think it's going to be an inflection point. So once the vaccine's here and we sort of get that out to the community and all those kinds of things, we can go back to some kind of normal. But I think that normal is going to look very different. And that normal is going to look different in part because our, the way that we manage the economy will be different. What we expect of our politicians will be different. How we work will be different. All of these things are going to have quite a big impact in the way that we operate. So please, when you think about 2021 and beyond, think about a world that is much more open to change than what we have seen in the last 30 years. Because I think the lessons of the pandemic is we can compress change, we can inflict a huge amount of change on the people, and a lot of us will be resilient and will thrive in those conditions. So where does that leave us? Because I think the backdrop of what the world looks like is going to be critical. I think, and I'm absolutely convinced about this, because when you look back through the sort of the eras of history, what you find is post the Second World War, we kind of built social democracy. And then we kind of went into the collapse of the currencies led us to thinking differently about money and banking. And then the stagflation of the 70s led us to sort of managing inflation in the economy, separation of government and economic management. So when we get this big catalysts, we change the way we operate, and that has profound impacts on what industries operate well, what kind of business practices work well, how politics is conducted. All those things shift, right? To me, it feels like we're in that moment of change again, that the last 30 years of whatever we did about independent central banks, relatively small government, relatively less interventionist government, relatively open borders, more globalism, those are all things that I think are under attack and are going to be very different going to the next 30 years. At least from a practical perspective for all of us, I think we know that central banks are likely to keep interest rates low, because if they raise interest rates, they'll just crush the economy, because there's just so much debt in both government and the private sectors. Instead, we're likely to see the government taking the big role in terms of managing the economy. So that is going to have quite a big impact. And I think the bigger question for us is thinking about, when government is involved, what are the kinds of things that they will be doing? And how does that affect us in our industries, in our region, or in the space that we operate, whether it's in the labor market, in hiring, or all of those kinds of things. But also, one of the things that really came through was just how uneven and variable the response was around the world to the pandemic. So we took one approach, and Australia took one other approach. America and Europe took a very different approach. And it seems to me like the world is becoming a more scary place. So that backlash against globalism, the backlash against immigration, the backlash against being open, those are things that are probably not going to go away. We just closed our borders for nearly a year, and our country hasn't ground to a standstill. And you have to ask, how valuable is it to have that open border? How valuable is it to have immigration? How valuable is it to have the amount of tourism that we had? These are really profound questions that are going to be brought to the fore by COVID-19. And when you think about the world as a slightly more scary place, there is a tendency to go, let's put up our shutters a bit more. Let's be a bit more cautious. Even when the vaccine's here, let's not be too rash about opening things up. So I think you just need to keep that as one possibility of how this next decade might unfold, is we might see a very changed perception of New Zealanders and our politicians of how open our community is, how open our country is to the rest of the world. I think we're going to see a real rise of much more homegrown, much more domestic, much more focused around how do we look after the people here without opening up the border as much as we used to have. And that will have very big implications for the labor market and what we face in businesses. Now, one of the things that, as you get older, you get more humility because you realize how little you know. So I've spent a lot of my life trying to forecast what's going to happen in the economy, what's going to happen to population, what's going to happen to interest rates. And I can tell you that quite confidently, we get both the direction and the magnitude wrong, right? So we're not much good at being able to predict the future. So I was talking to the Auckland Council last week, and we were just talking about what's happening in the economy and what's going to happen. And one of the issues is when you're planning for something that's quite long term, you can have this huge array of outcomes. We just don't know what might happen, right? So in 1996, we thought the population of Auckland would grow in the kind of trend that we had, right? And that seems reasonable, except of course the reality was much bigger growth than we experienced. And the difference between reality and what we had expected was 177,000 people, 57,000 households. So we planned not to build enough homes for the population growth that actually turned out. So the future is extremely unknown, right? And it's not just when it comes to what's happening with population, it's not the Statistics New Zealand fault in getting their projections wrong. You can see on the right-hand side, those are the forecasts for interest rates from the Reserve Bank. You've got a building full of economists, and their only job is to do this. And they've been getting it wrong for 10 years too. So it's not so much that I think we get a forecast wrong. Of course, they will always be wrong because the future is unknown. So many things can happen. Much more important, and I think the lesson from 2020 must be that we got to do rigorous scenario planning. Yes, you should have strategic directions. You should have a central case of where the world might go and how you might operate your business. But make sure you have some scenarios of those very extreme events like we have experienced, and stress test how your business might respond, what you might do, how would you look after your people, how do you make sure you still maintain that culture and cohesion of your business, because those are the fundamental drivers of business success. You can't pin it on forecasts, because the reality is that what happens is so much about the actions we take and not just about what's happening outside of our control. So just really urge you to think about your strategic planning very, in a much more flexible manner than you might have done in the past. Do really good scenario planning, throw out some good ideas, just be brave and bold, because you know what? 2020 has shown us that completely unexpected things might happen, but also what we saw was we can see this extraordinary response from our business, from our teams, from our industry, from our country, and some of it can be a force for good. Now, what is the labor market context? So I think, we wanted to talk about this, right? So the big issue for me is that unusually in this recession, it's been a very uneven impact. What we saw was we didn't see all the parts of the economy moving up and down in the same kind of synchronized manner that we tend to see. Instead, we saw very concentrated pain in some areas, and at the same time, massive shortages of labor in many others. Job ads are at a record high. So, what's extraordinary for me is in November, job ads in New Zealand are up like 7%. In most of Europe, they're down 20 to 50%. In the UK, they're down 50%. So, we're seeing this massive divergence in terms of labor market outcomes, what businesses are actually prepared to do, and we're seeing some really big challenges and divergences coming through both globally and locally. And also, I think there's some pretty big policy issues that are coming up. One of the things we're grappling with our business is, how do you think about health and safety when lots of your staff are working from home? How do you make sure, what is your policy around desks and chairs and occupational hazards when people are working from home? These are all things that we hadn't really thought about 12 months ago, and all of a sudden they become the norm for the kinds of things that we might want to think about. First, I think the good news. The labour market's been extraordinarily resilient. So on the left-hand side, you can see the number of people in New Zealand who are employed, and that's the level. And you can see that in the 2008-2009 period, we had the job losses. The recession was pretty painful, no surprises. And it took us nearly a decade to recover from that. But then we had very steady, strong growth over the last 10 years. And then things had been coming off just a little bit in late 2019. And then the pandemic hit and we got that drop in employment. But once all the restrictions were removed, things bounced back pretty quickly. A lot of that was to do with the wage subsidies and other things, because the businesses and employment could be retained. So the level of employment that we're seeing at the moment is very similar to what we had seen in January, February, in the beginning of this year. But this is not to minimize that there are some people who have lost their jobs. So over the course of the last sort of 9 months, we've seen close to 70,000 people who've lost their jobs. So there's been a huge amount of pain for a few people, right? So the context is there are 2.7 million people who work in New Zealand. Out of that, about 70,000 people have lost their jobs. But look at the chart on the right-hand side. The number of people who are receiving unemployment benefits and are on the COVID income related payments, that number is probably is the worst that we have seen since the big recession of the late 80s and early 90s. Those of you who remember that recession, it was hugely painful. And it was hugely painful, particularly for young people whose careers were delayed by years, if not decades. And that really has quite a big impact. So think about what's going on in this recession is actually a little bit different from what we see in normal recessions like we saw in 2008. So in 2008, 2009, we had a pretty big recession. It took about 18 months for us to lose jobs, about 80,000 jobs. In contrast, we've seen this very compressed, big spike in job losses in a very short period of time for a very specific group of people. So I haven't got the chart here of the age groups, but essentially, if you break it down by age, job losses have been only for people under 30, and jobs for people over 30 have gone up. There are more people over 30 who are employed, and there's been huge job losses for people under 30. And so that's not surprising given what kind of job losses we've seen, right? It's been job losses in retail and hospo, so sales workers, clerical and administrative workers. So quite often the job losses have been in that more of that, I think, less, more expendable, at least from the business size. And that had a very regional impact as well. So it was less about industries and more about kind of the types of jobs and occupations that were lost. So, that had a big impact on Auckland, Wellington, Otago because of its tourism mix, mainly Queenstown and Mackenzie and those kinds of places. So a very uneven mix. But look at the top of those charts. The number of jobs in management, professional jobs have gone up. The number of jobs in the provinces, in the Waikato, in the Manawatu Wanganui, they've gone up. And in Canterbury, they've gone up. I was in Christchurch yesterday. Things actually feel okay in those places. They're kind of like, we haven't really felt the recession. Sure, the tourism parts are doing it hard, but the rest of the economy is actually pumping along really well. Very unusual recession, and it's very uneven. And I don't think it's going to last. I think the next phase of this COVID disruption is going to affect our provinces a bit more because the exports will be affected from a global economy that is going to be slower. It is going to be about our shipping capacity not being very good. It is about the New Zealand dollar appreciating. It is about the cost of transport going up. So there's a whole bunch of things that are going on that are, again, very unusual from a normal recession. There are a couple of reasons why, I think we should be optimistic. One is around business behavior is telling us that actually things are looking okay. So if you look at business confidence, their own activity, hiring intentions, and the number of ads that they're positions, vacancies that they're advertising, things are actually looking okay. And you can see through on the left-hand side chart, that's the number of job ads on TrainMe. They fell off very sharply, as you'd expect, in the first lockdown, right? Everybody was uncertain. And then when we had the economy sort of open up, things kind of went back to where they were. But really, it's been since about late August when businesses kind of went, actually, we're seeing lots of demand, not evenly across every industry, but generally speaking, we're seeing better demand and we've seen activity going up. The other thing that we saw was we learned how to deal with lockdowns and uncertainty better. So when the first lockdowns happened, we moved very sharply into working from home. So broadband use just went up by like 90% over the course of the first lockdown. The second time around was about 60%, understandably, because it was only for Auckland. But persistently, what we're seeing is, we're seeing people working from home maybe up about 15 to 20% from what we had seen this time last year, which is pretty extraordinary. Now, what is really bizarre is that we talk about labor shortages regardless of what's happening in the economy, right? It doesn't matter whether the economy is going up or down. We just can't find good people, enough people, all those other bits and pieces. Businesses might not be confident enough to hire, but actually finding candidates remains really tough. So when I look at what's happening in terms of the number of candidates, so the number of unemployed folk versus the number of vacancies that are being advertised, we saw this initially, there was this kind of easing up of conditions, but very quickly businesses started looking for more stuff, and every business industry that I speak to are saying it's actually really, really hard to find staff. So it's not surprising, because if you look on the right-hand side, I think that has a big part of the story. Net migration has gone to practically zero. While there are lots of New Zealanders who are coming home, there are also a lot of foreign nationals who are on short-term visas in New Zealand that are leaving. So net, we're probably not going to see net migration being very positive for quite some time. Now, this has a real challenge, right? Because, like I said before, the job losses have been very concentrated in one part of society. Young people in particular occupations, quite often in sales, in clerical, administrative jobs. The job demand, the new job openings are not in those places. So they're not transferable, or they're not in the right locations. Or it's in horticulture where it's out in the provinces, far away from places. The pay is low, working conditions are hard, and you know what? They're going to have to change their practices a lot. So migration, which has been such a big safety valve for our labor market, our ability to attract both unskilled and skilled labor, that is going to be truly tested. If you look at across our industries, what you'll find is a lot of the industries that are very reliant on net migration tend to have very low wages and very high profits. So there is a real mismatch in terms of, I think, what you'd call exploitation for those business models. And that is going to be something that will be very much in the political agenda over the next little while. So don't expect the government's just going to roll over and let migration come through again. I think this is going to be one of those policy areas that is going to be a really big binding constraint in us being able to access labor in the future. And that means we have to think much longer term about developing talent, career progression, all those other bits and pieces that we could almost do without until now. But if net migration, if I'm right, and net migration is no longer so easy, I think we're going to find it really hard. Now, the other thing that's going on, of course, is, you can't get away from it. House prices are increasing at 15-20% a year. I was in Gisborne a month ago, and the house prices there have increased by 60% in 12 months. So there's some extraordinary changes that are going on. But for a lot of places, what we're seeing is young people and people who are moving for work are going, well, I've got to be able to afford to live in this particular place. In the last sort of 20 years, we've seen incomes rise, but not as much as rents, mortgage payments, or the cost of a house. So we're going to see those pressures continuing to come through. The reality is that there are no easy fixes when it comes to our congestion problems, our house price problems, and those kinds of things. Those things will take years to fix. And if that is the case, then we're going to have to think about how do we create enough flexible working conditions to be able to still get the talent that we want and still get the culture and cohesion that we want and the outputs and outcomes that we want from our staff. For me, the COVID experience was extraordinary. That, normally we have about, I don't know, maybe 500,000 people who will sometimes work from home, right? That was kind of what we saw before the COVID thing hit. And during the lockdowns, we saw 1 million people work from home, which is pretty huge. So lots of people were not able to work from home because if you're in sales or manufacturing or whatever, those jobs are not easily transferable. So that's not surprising. But we saw this extraordinary uptake of technology, investment in technology, changes in business practices, trusting staff more. There were some huge changes that took place. But now that the immediacy of the pandemic is over, I think it's really important to also think about the trade-offs that we make. So I work from home in Auckland, my team is in Wellington. I find that quite challenging, keeping that culture together, keep that cohesion within the team. That's actually really, really difficult. That's one of the big challenges of flexible working conditions and working from home. So when we have flexible working conditions and we're thinking about offering that as a perk or a way of life that people want, we also have to think about what is right for our business. I cannot emphasize enough, the reason for cities is because it's a place for us to mingle and share ideas, and that's serendipity, right? Just having that bumping into somebody and going, oh yeah, I thought about that. And you know what? We'll just solve it right now because we are seeing each other right now. Those chance meetings, those chance encounters, that bonding that takes place, that problem solving that takes place, there's a huge amount of creativity that takes place. We might have to think about unpacking roles in terms of things that are routine and can be done offsite and is not required in terms of culture and cohesion. So we might have to think entirely differently about what people do, how people do things. So we're going to have to be very creative to take advantage of the successes I think we have experienced over the course of the last 12 months. But don't be naive in thinking that this is a sustainable solution that is not going to have negative consequences, because I know from a lot of the businesses that I deal with that working from home is nice. But you know what, for young people, it is not so nice because they don't have a good place to work. And you know what, they need their mentors, they need their managers, they need their leaders, they need their teams. So finding the right balance to get the best out of everybody and the best outcome for your community, for your staff, is going to be really, really important. One of the challenges, of course, is, there is nowhere to hide. So when you think about what was happening, say, in 2013, you can see on the left-hand side, places like Wellington were very affordable, right? So if you wanted to poach staff, you could just go, well, we'll just get the talent from Auckland because you know what? We'll give them an escape route. The problem now is if you look on the right-hand side, housing and those pressures, affordability pressures, have become widespread across New Zealand. And so there are fewer places for people to escape. We have to think really cleverly about how do we create something that gives people an ability to still live a comfortable lifestyle. So they're not rat racing to the office, working multiple jobs, working extraordinary hours to be able to make things work. Because the other thing that the COVID thing really kind of threw up for me was mental health, and the impact of pressure and that constantly being on are actually really quite detrimental. So there is a lot of responsibility on us as employers, as businesses, as colleagues, as staff, to make sure that we work in a way that's sustainable, because ultimately what we're trying to create is an environment within our business that is going to be successful. So what are the key messages that I want to get across to you today? Well, it's the same messages that I tell you every time we do these labor and economic reports. That's because that's what makes a good business. The first thing is around knowing your business. It's so critical to understand what you do, your industry, your location, because you know what? Don't rely on what's happening out in the broader economy as an indicator of what's going to happen to you. So much of what you do is in your control. You have things that are unique about you, that are strong, that are weak, that makes you who you are. So knowing your business really well is extraordinarily important. And I think that has been one of the big messages of the last year. Unusually, I think one of the big drivers of the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to be about understanding government. Now, I think that's something that we don't do very well in New Zealand, particularly in places like Auckland. Wellington feels like a foreign land, right? They have a different way of doing things, a different language, a different way of operating. But you know what? Government is going to be in the driving seat when it comes to economic policy, economic management, and all of those bits and pieces. Decisions that are being made in Wellington need the influence of all of us, but also we need to be able to respond as quickly and as early as possible, so we're prepared to, one, minimize costs where they're possible, where they like to give costs, but also to take advantage of opportunities that will also come. I've been working as an economist for 20 years, and the whole time we've been talking about labor shortages in New Zealand. They're still here. They're not going to go away. They're a big issue. You make that as your core part of how you operate. But the big thing I want you to think about is there's been a lot of stuff that has happened this year. There's a lot of uncertainty of what might come. The thing that has gotten us through the best over the course of the last 12 months is culture and cohesion. Think about how do we make the most of that, because that's what will give you the most flexible workforce, the most flexible business, and the most successful business. So I might stop my presentation there and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Shamubeel. The team have been collecting the questions, and some of the questions that have come through have been around, for example, the economy, sick leave, finding people, and unemployment. One that we've grouped together, which centers around the economy, is how long can we keep going without the money of tourism? What is buffering the impact of this right now?
The answer is we can go on forever. As a country, we don't need any one industry, right? But that's not a useful answer for the businesses that are being affected by it. So the answer is we could never open our borders and we would still have an economy, and we would still have a relatively successful economy. But for a lot of regions and a lot of industries and a lot of businesses, it would be extraordinarily painful. So at rough count, our tourism industry has shrunk by about 25%, but our overall economy is probably not that far off what it was. So it gives you a sense of what's been going on is things move around in the economy, but the winners and losers are not the same. So from an aggregate perspective, I'd say it doesn't matter, but from a very specific tourism perspective, it is intensely painful, and this pain is not going to go away anytime soon. My expectation is the level of tourism globally won't return to normal until 2024. There is simply not enough capacity in airlines. The cost of services is going to change. Carbon price is going to come in globally. So it's unlikely that we're going to go back to the norm that we had experienced pre-COVID. So look, there is no political win in opening up the border until we're absolutely confident that the COVID pandemic is under control.
Yeah, that's interesting. You also spoke about industrial policy changing and businesses and in general the economy looking towards more homegrown. Do you have any ideas of what homegrown might look like?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're going to see lots of examples of that. Part of that is going to be, I think, a rejigging of what was, for example, the Provincial Growth Fund under the last term. I mean, that was much more of a political tool, but that was really about pumping money into particular things and ideas, right? I think the big catalyst that we're going to see in the next 12 months is probably going to be the carbon budget that's going to come out from the Climate Commission in February. That is going to lay out what's required for us to get to zero carbon. Now, if you think about one part of the economy you really want to grow, it's the green part of the economy, right? We've made this commitment to get to net zero, and yet we have actually been increasing our emissions. So around the green economy, I think we're going to see significant investment. That is going to include things like increases in our generation capacity, our transmission capacity, our charging and distribution capacity. We're also going to see, big changes in industries that are big users. So around transport, public transport, heavy transport, around, how energy efficient homes are. So there's lots of these kinds of things that are going to take place. But also we're going to see, I think, some real local issues coming through. There are lots of communities that can't afford increases in rates anymore to pay for essential infrastructure and other things. So we're going to see these quite local pressures also coming through for government to intervene. And I think what we're going to see is, like I said before, that slightly more insular approach when it comes to the world. I don't think net migration will open up so much. There'll be one way of trying to protect New Zealanders saying, listen, business, if you want somebody, you either train somebody from here or do without. And I think that's a pretty big change from what we've seen in the past. So a lot of the policy shifts may not be specific to specific industries. I think what we're going to see is a suite of things that are happening in different parts of the economy, but they're all collectively going to mean that government is just much more involved in our business lives than they have been in the past.
Yeah, that's right, Shamubeel. And I guess one of the other questions that has grouped together is the question around the proposed 10 days sick leave and, the policies on that and the impact of SMEs. So we are seeing more and more policies that will create more cost on business. What are your thoughts on the impact of SMEs, given the policy changes that we're seeing coming through, as well as the law changes?
Yeah, look, I think we'll see a lot more of it. So we've had the minimum wage increases, health and safety changes. We're going to see the holiday entitlements change. There's a couple of things. One, in places like Australia and other countries, their holiday entitlements sick leave entitlements are actually higher than ours, right? And their economy hasn't shut down. Their cost of wages are higher and their economies haven't shut down. So I think we just need to be mindful that when we see these changes, there will be just some businesses that will not be able to cope because their business model simply does not work. It's like, for example, if you think about what's happening in the horticulture sector right now, if you want workers, you're going to have to pay them more. Well, there are still strawberries at the supermarket and at the farmers markets, right? So some businesses are doing it okay, but others are not. And it's the distribution. So it's not whole industries want to get killed off. There will be some operators who operate at the margin and their business case is simply not going to stack up anymore. So it is going to be tough on a lot of folk. And I think the reality is, if you can't cope with these increases in costs of doing business, then you can't be in business.
Or cut down on your headcount, I guess, is going to be one of the things that businesses will do. So interesting times ahead, and as you say, still an unusual recession that we're facing. One of the things that we have seen as well with the border closures, obviously, is that that reliance that a lot of the universities have had on international students and the funds that come through from the international students. That's been quite heavy hitting on the universities. Do you have any insights on whether this will continue, whether the borders will at least open to students, or?
Well, that's a good question. I guess the starting point is actually most of the students are still here. So they didn't all leave when the pandemic hit. So there's still quite a large population, but it's less than it was. So the issue for universities and private tertiary education providers is that as these visas expire, they're not being renewed. So those people are going back to their home countries. So yes, it's going to be painful for a lot of these providers. I think for PTEs, it's going to be much harder than for the universities. But it's more about they can't get the growth in the number of overseas students, which are extremely lucrative. And in fact, they are the students that actually subsidize our domestic students. Will it be opened up? The answer is no. We are only going to see a very small opening up of very highly skilled PhD and postgrad students. We're not going to see the open slather of every student being able to come back for some time. So I think that's a story for 2022, not for 2021.
Thanks, Shamubeel. That's interesting, particularly given the shortages in healthcare, doctors, nurses. We still continue to have shortages there, so it will be interesting to see what happens there. Looking at the private sector versus the government sector, it seems that government jobs were not as highly impacted as the private sector. And, somebody mentions that this smacks of protectionism, particularly pre-election. Do you have any views on this and whether this will continue, whether there will be any impact in the government sector?
I'm not sure I agree. The biggest growth in job ads has been in the construction sector, right? So in fact, most of the growth has been in the private sector. Very little of it has actually, in fact, taken place in the public sector. The public sector has been growing, and it's not surprising because, as you know, under National, we had 9 years of sinking lids and sinking budgets, which reduced the size of the public sector. And now it's growing again as it normally does under Labour government. So I'm not surprised that has taken place. I expect that to continue to grow. Wellington will continue to be a place that will have, I think, quite a lot of activity and quite a lot of employment growth. But I'll just be careful to have blanket statements like it's only government, because that hasn't been the case. Like I said before, there's only actually been a very small subset of occupations and industries and regions that have been affected. Across the rest of the economy, things are actually growing pretty well, and almost all of it is in the private sector. So, the point of having an economy that's relatively open and functioning is you and I can go ahead and do stuff. So no, look, I don't think it smacks of protectionism. I think what it says is structurally, you've got a Labour government in power that's going to have a bigger public sector. But the real benefit is actually we have an economy that's functional. And that's why we have job ads that are up 7% from last year, unlike down 20 or 50% as it is in Europe.
Thanks, Shamubeel. One of the key grouping of questions was obviously on the finding of Labour, but I think you've answered that mostly. And one of the questions was whether the borders will open to allow more of those labour shortages to be managed. But I guess
slowly. I think a little bit at the margins. I mean, you've seen that they stepped back a little bit on the RSE workers, for example, but only a little bit, right? So the issue for them is there is actually no political win from opening the border up, and also there is no public health win from opening the border up. So you should not expect that just because we want that to open up from a business perspective, that the politicians are going to do it.
Interesting. Thank you. One of the questions was, what difference can the vaccine make to the economy in New Zealand?
Well, I mean, it's going to be extraordinary in that we can go back to normal if we want to, right? So essentially we can have open borders again. If most of the population is vaccinated, then it won't matter so much, right? So you can kind of go back to relative norm. So the quickness of the adoption and deployment of vaccines is going to be really critical. So we're really talking about herd immunity from that sense, because enough people are vaccinated. By the way, this has been one of the misconceptions in the conversation around the pandemic. People were talking about herd immunity in places like the UK and Sweden, which was never their strategy. It was their strategy to just infect more people and kill more people. But you can't get herd immunity without a vaccine. So the vaccine is the answer in terms of how do we stop having to close borders and those kinds of things. What I'm saying is that that's not enough. Just because you have a vaccine doesn't mean the politicians will want to open things up and take things back to where they were. Because you know what? Our experience of the last 9 months is even when borders are closed, the economy still functions. Society is not unhappy. Things happen.
Yeah, true. Very good. And then in terms of unemployment, a question here is, do you see unemployment peaking at any point?
Unemployment has already peaked. It's been coming down for the last few months. So since late August, it's been trending down, but only very gradually, right? So again, it's that mismatch thing. So there is growth in jobs, there's growth in job ads, but the people who lost their jobs they don't have the right skills and ability to fill the vacancies that are being created. So I expect that retail and hospital sector to do it tough. I expect a lot of the gains from technology in the administration and clerical services are never going to come back, right? If you suddenly switch from a bookkeeper to zero and you go, actually, this work's a treat, you're not going to go back to the old way of doing things. So I suspect some of the job losses that we have seen in the last 9 months will stick. And, at the moment, my big fear is whether or not the slowdown we're seeing globally, particularly with the second wave, whether that affects exports in our provincial economies. So more of the jobs in our provincial economies in growing food, manufacturing and distributing that stuff.
You talk about the next phase of the recession. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the first phase of the recession was just uncertainty, right? We didn't know how to deal with the pandemic, so that we shut everything down and we had that huge disruption. And then we kind of went through the last 6 months, which was more about trying to live with the virus, right? And the next phase, which is, I think, the story of the first half of 2021, is more about how do we deal with the consequences of it? Because there have been massive job losses around the world. There has been huge disruptions in economies, in industries. That has ramifications. So, for example, we export a lot of food. What happens to those food exports if the restaurants aren't open, if people are eating differently? Does that mean that we export less, or are the prices lower? So that phase of the recession, I think, is more normal from a recession perspective, but it hasn't started yet. So that's the thing that I'm watching out for. That's my fear of the next 12 months. If I had to pick a downside, that would be the downside. The optimism that I have is because there is a vaccine that's coming, and I suspect what we'll see is lots of the economy is going to start opening up quite quickly once the vaccine starts rolling out. And that might counter some of the slowdown that we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Shamubeel. I think we've kind of reached that point now where we're about to finish the webinar. Your insights have been extremely interesting and valuable, and you've provided very good takeaways for us to think about as we move towards 2021. It's so difficult to cover every single question that we would want to ask you. On behalf of Beyond Recruitment, I'd like to thank you all for joining this webinar. This webinar has been recorded, and we will send you a copy together with a copy of our Beyond Economic and Labour report and salary guideline, which has been updated during this COVID period. Once again, a huge thanks to all our respondents for completing the survey. As you know, this year, given it's been a tough year for so many, we're electing to give back to the community rather than give out prizes. We are therefore putting your names into a hat to draw 3 lucky people who will be lucky enough to be able to donate an amount of $500 each on behalf of ourselves to one of the following charities, in addition to what we donate annually. The charities that we've included in this are the Cancer Society, the Heart Foundation, Kids Can, SPCA, Kiwis for Kiwis, St. John's, Starship, Muscular Dystrophy of New Zealand, and we'll announce the 3 lucky people in the next week or so. So a huge thanks to you, Shamubeel. We always appreciate sharing this time together and partnering with you. This year certainly has been an interesting year, not only economically, politically, but also in terms of the labour market. We'd like to take the opportunity now of wishing you all a happy festive season and a great summer break, and we look forward to hosting more webinars with Shamubeel in the new year. Once again, thank you.